Malcolm Little stood outside the Roseland State Ballroom, polishing brass door handles each morning. He arrived before the dancers left, and stayed long after the music stopped echoing. His clothes moved in tight circles, removing fingerprints left by white patrons earlier. The manager watched from inside through glass panels that reflected Malcolm's bent posture. Malcolm kept his head angled down, even when no one seemed to watch. His shoes were shined daily, though the floor he mopped would dirty them. He carried a second shirt in his bag in case sweat showed through. The manager had mentioned visible sweat twice during Malcolm's first week of work. Malcolm now changed shirts in the basement storage room before clocking out each night. His time card showed arrival 30 minutes early, but payment began only at scheduled time. The basement smelled like cleaning solution mixed with cigarette smoke from the previous night's crowds. Malcolm stored his bag behind the mops, where managers rarely looked during their inspections. He learned which floorboards creaked and stepped. Carefully to avoid drawing supervisory attention downstairs, the head porter had worked there for 9 years and never received a raise. Malcolm listened when the porter explained which complaints to absorb without verbal response. A white patron had accused the porter of theft 3 years before investigations. The porter kept working through 2 weeks of searching and questioning and suspicion. Nothing was found, but the porter's locker was moved closer to supervision. Malcolm noticed his own locker was already positioned near the manager's basement office. He asked no questions about the placement and unpacked his supplies silently. His shift began at CX, but buses from Roxbury ran unreliably during morning hours. Malcolm started waking at 4:30 to ensure arrival before the manager checked. The manager recorded late arrivals on a small notebook he carried in his jacket. Malcolm had seen 3 names written there during his first month employed full-time. 2 of those workers no longer appeared on the weekly schedule rotation sheet. The 3rd worker now cleans toilets exclusively instead of working the main floor. Malcolm kept his own notebook tracking which tasks earned approval and which drew silence. Silence meant the task was recorded as incomplete, even when Malcolm had finished. He began photographing completed work areas mentally to describe them if questioned later. The manager never asked, but Malcolm prepared answers matching the documentation system exactly. A white woman dropped her purse near the coat check during Saturday's service. Malcolm picked it up and walked it immediately to the manager's desk upstairs. The manager opened the purse and counted the money inside before thanking Malcolm briefly. Malcolm returned to mopping, but the manager called him back. Within 5 minutes, exactly, the woman had reported her purse missing before Malcolm delivered it to supervision. The manager asked why Malcolm had walked away from his assigned section without permission. Malcolm explained he was returning lost property, but the manager wrote something down. The woman received her purse and left without speaking to Malcolm directly afterward. The manager told Malcolm that protocol required reporting found items before touching them personally. Malcolm apologized and returned to his mop, which had dried completely during the interaction. His younger sister, Ella, visited Boston from Michigan and needed temporary housing assistance immediately. Malcolm asked the manager if extra weekend hours were available to earn money. The manager said weekend positions were already filled by employees with better attendance records. Malcolm's attendance record showed 0 absences, but the manager did not clarify further. Malcolm worked his regular shift and asked the head porter about outside work. The porter knew a family needing yard work done on Sunday for cash. Malcolm worked on Sunday and gave Ella the money for 1 week's room rental. The manager asked on Monday why Malcolm looked tired and mentioned consistent energy is essential. Malcolm said he had slept poorly, but would maintain full energy throughout today's shift. The manager wrote something in his notebook and walked away without additional comment. White patrons sometimes left tips on tables after private events in the ballroom sections. The manager collected all tips and distributed them according to a system never explained. Malcolm received $2 at the end of 1 month, despite collecting approximately. The head porter received $3 that month, despite working the same total hours. Malcolm asked the manager about the tip distribution formula used for calculating payments. The manager said tips reflected overall service quality as reported by satisfied patrons individually. Malcolm asked if patrons submitted written reports, but the manager ended the conversation. Malcolm stopped asking questions and accepted the $2 without signing any receipt. The next month, Malcolm received $1. And the porter received $2.50. Malcolm placed the dollar in his pocket and returned to scrubbing baseboards silently. A drunk patron vomited near the stage during a Thursday night big band performance. Malcolm cleaned it immediately while the band continued playing and couples kept dancing close. The patron's friends laughed, and one of them kicked Malcolm's bucket accidentally hard. Water spilled across the floor, creating a larger mess than the original vomit. Malcolm refilled the bucket and cleaned again while the friends watched and smoked cigarettes. One friend asked Malcolm if he enjoyed cleaning up after his betters constantly. Malcolm said nothing and wrung out the mop into the bucket carefully and slowly. The friend repeated the question louder, so nearby dancers turned to observe the interaction. Malcolm said he was just doing his job and kept his eyes down. The manager appeared and thanked the patrons' friends for their patience during the cleanup. Malcolm's brother, Reginald, wrote from Michigan, asking about job opportunities in the Boston area. Malcolm wrote back, explaining the Roseland job, but warned about the manager's notebook system. Reginald arrived 2 weeks later, and Malcolm helped him find a dishwashing position. The restaurant manager asked Malcolm how long he had known Reginald and their relationship. Malcolm said Reginald was his brother and had always been reliable and hardworking. The manager hired Reginald, but mentioned that Malcolm's reputation depended on Reginald's performance. Reginald lasted 3 weeks before the restaurant manager fired him for talking back. Malcolm's manager at Roseland mentioned hearing about the incident from the restaurant owner. Malcolm apologized, though he had not been present during his brother's termination incident. The manager said nothing further, but moved Malcolm from the main floor to the basement. Basement work meant Malcolm no longer interacted with patrons or received tip money. His hourly wage remained identical, but his monthly income dropped by approximately half. Malcolm asked if the basement assignment was temporary, but the manager called it. The manager said it was a reassignment based on operational needs within the facility. Malcolm worked in the basement, cleaning storage areas and organizing supplies for 6 weeks. He saw the main floor only when delivering supplies to the head porter. The head porter avoided eye contact and spoke only when absolutely necessary for work. Malcolm realized the porter feared association with someone recently reassigned to basement operations exclusively. Malcolm stopped attempting conversation and focused on moving supplies quickly and efficiently without pause. The manager observed these deliveries and timed them with a pocket watch twice weekly. Malcolm began studying the manager's patterns to avoid unnecessary interactions that created documentation. The manager arrived at 8:15 and checked the basement at 8:45. Malcolm ensured all morning tasks were completed and visible by 8:30 exactly. The manager walked through, nodded once, and returned upstairs without speaking or writing. On days when Malcolm finished at 8:35, the manager wrote in his notebook. Malcolm adjusted his wake time to 4:15 to ensure earlier task completion. The manager began arriving at 8 o'clock and checking the basement at 8:20. Malcolm woke at 3:45 and caught earlier buses to maintain his margin. The manager never acknowledged the adjustment but stopped writing during morning inspections. Malcolm felt exhausted constantly, but maintained the schedule for 3 consecutive months without absence. A patron claimed Malcolm had been rude during a supply delivery to the coat check area upstairs. Malcolm had not spoken to any patron that day except to say "excuse me" when passing by carefully. The manager called Malcolm to his office and asked for Malcolm's version of the incident clearly. Malcolm explained he had only said "excuse me" and had not engaged in any conversation beyond that exchange. The manager said the patron felt Malcolm's tone had been disrespectful and threatening somehow. Malcolm asked what tone would be appropriate, but the manager said that wasn't relevant. The manager placed Malcolm on a today unpaid suspension pending a full review. Malcolm asked what review process would be followed, but the manager dismissed him immediately. Malcolm left the building and walked to Roxbury, wondering how the rent would be paid. Ella had returned to Michigan, and Malcolm lived alone in a rented room now. The review concluded after 5 days, instead of 2 without explanation for the delay. Malcolm returned to work and found his locker had been moved to a different basement section entirely. His new locker was located directly outside the manager's office door, where visibility was constant. The manager said the move improved operational efficiency, and Malcolm should resume his duties. Malcolm unpacked his bag and began cleaning, but noticed the head porter was now there. The head porter had been promoted to floor supervisor and wore a different uniform. A new porter had been hired and introduced himself to Malcolm briefly before starting work. The new porter was white and had no prior experience in ballroom maintenance work. Malcolm trained him for 2 weeks, showing him every task and procedural requirement carefully. The manager observed the training and took notes in his notebook 4 separate times. The new porter made mistakes that Malcolm corrected quietly to avoid drawing managerial attention. The manager saw Malcolm correcting the porter and called Malcolm to his office afterward. The manager said Malcolm was not authorized to provide training or instruction to any staff member ever. Malcolm explained he was only helping ensure tasks were completed correctly as required. The manager said help had not been requested, and Malcolm should focus on his own assigned responsibilities alone. Malcolm apologized and returned to the basement to work on inventory organization and cleaning. The new porter continued making mistakes that went uncorrected and created additional work for everyone. Malcolm cleaned up after the mistakes silently and never mentioned them to anyone. The manager promoted the new porter to assistant supervisor after only 2 months of total employment. Malcolm remained in the basement, organizing supplies and avoiding all contact with supervisors or patrons. Malcolm's pay was reduced by 15 cents per hour without a written explanation or a warning. His paycheck reflected the decrease, and he brought it to the manager's attention immediately. The manager said the reduction reflected Malcolm's current basement duties versus floor work previously. Malcolm explained his duties had increased since he now managed all supply inventory alone. The manager said job classifications were determined by management and were not negotiable ever. Malcolm asked for written documentation of the pay reduction, and the manager refused clearly. The manager said requesting documentation showed an adversarial attitude toward management and the establishment. Malcolm returned to work and calculated he would miss rent by $8. He asked the head porter about weekend work, but the porter said nothing. The new assistant supervisor overheard and reported the conversation to the manager within minutes. The manager called Malcolm upstairs and asked why he needed additional money suddenly. Malcolm explained his pay had been reduced and rent was due on Friday. The manager said personal financial planning was not the establishment's responsibility or concern at all. Malcolm said nothing further and waited to be dismissed from the small office. The manager asked if Malcolm had been seeking employment elsewhere during work hours recently. Malcolm said he had not and had only asked about weekend work. The manager wrote extensively in his notebook for nearly 3 full minutes while Malcolm stood. The manager dismissed Malcolm without explanation, and Malcolm returned to the basement storage area. Malcolm's locker was searched that afternoon while he was cleaning the furnace room. Nothing was taken, but his spare shirt had been unfolded and examined carefully. Malcolm began carrying all personal items on his body during every shift he worked. His bag contained only work supplies that belonged to the Roseland State Ballroom. The manager noticed the change and asked why Malcolm no longer used his locker. Malcolm said he preferred keeping personal items with him for convenience and efficiency. The manager said using assigned lockers was mandatory for all employees without exception. Malcolm placed his empty bag in the locker and kept his wallet in his pocket. The manager inspected the locker and asked where Malcolm's extra shirt had gone recently. Malcolm said he no longer brought an extra shirt since the basement work produced less sweat. The manager wrote in his notebook and told Malcolm to resume his basement duties immediately. Malcolm walked downstairs and realized every explanation he provided created additional documentation against him. A pipe burst in the basement, flooding the storage area during Malcolm's Wednesday shift. Malcolm shut off the water valve and began moving supplies to higher shelving quickly. The manager came downstairs and asked why Malcolm had not reported the flood immediately. Malcolm explained he had stopped the water first to prevent additional damage to property. The manager said protocol required reporting all emergencies before taking any independent action whatsoever. Malcolm apologized and continued moving wet supplies while the manager observed and wrote notes. The manager left and returned with the assistant supervisor, who photographed the flooded area. Malcolm was sent home for the day without pay, pending an investigation into procedures. The investigation took 1 week, during which Malcolm received no pay or communication. Malcolm spent his savings on rent and ate 1 meal daily to stretch the remaining money. The investigation concluded that Malcolm had violated emergency protocols by acting without authorization from management. Malcolm was issued a written warning that would remain in his permanent employment file. The manager said future violations would result in immediate termination without appeal or review. Malcolm signed the warning document and received a copy on yellow paper, stamped he returned to work in the basement, which had been cleaned by other staff. Several supplies had been damaged by water, and Malcolm was told to document each loss. He spent 2 days creating an inventory list of damaged items with descriptions and values. The manager reviewed the list and said Malcolm's delay in reporting had caused the losses. The cost of damaged supplies would be deducted from Malcolm's future paychecks in installments. Malcolm calculated that the deductions would take 7 months to complete at his reduced wage. Malcolm stopped speaking and less directly asked a question requiring a verbal response for work. He answered in the fewest words possible and never volunteered additional information or context. The manager noted Malcolm's silence and asked if he was experiencing a bad attitude. Malcolm said he was focused on completing his duties correctly and efficiently as required. The manager said a positive attitude was part of job performance and would be evaluated. Malcolm said he understood and returned to cleaning the basement floor thoroughly and quietly. The assistant supervisor began conducting daily inspections of Malcolm's work area at random times. Malcolm kept every surface clean constantly, so inspections revealed nothing worth documenting or noting. The assistant supervisor began timing how long Malcolm took for each individual task assigned. Malcolm worked faster, but the assistant supervisor wrote down times regardless of the speed achieved. A white employee was hired to work alongside Malcolm Malcolm in the basement storage area. The new employee was paid 25 cents more per hour for identical work. Malcolm learned this when the new employee mentioned his starting wage during a conversation. Malcolm said nothing and continued organizing supplies on the metal shelving units carefully. The new employee complained frequently about the basement work being beneath his skill level. Actually, the manager listened to these complaints and reassured the employee about future advancement. Malcolm overheard these conversations, but kept working and never raised his eyes or head. The new employee was promoted to the main floor within 6 weeks of their hire date. Malcolm remained in the basement, and his pay stayed reduced, with ongoing deductions continuing. The manager hired another white employee to replace the promoted worker in the basement storage. Malcolm's mother wrote from Michigan saying she was ill and needed help immediately. Malcolm requested 3 days of unpaid leave to visit her in Lansing urgently. The manager said leave requests required 2 weeks advance notice per employee handbook policy. Malcolm explained his mother's illness was unexpected, and he had just received word today. The manager said family emergencies were unfortunate, but policy existed for operational reasons. Malcolm asked if any exception process existed for documented emergencies, like serious. The manager said exceptions required director approval, and the director was unavailable for 2 weeks. Malcolm said he would work through the situation and not take leave currently. His mother's condition worsened, and she was hospitalized, according to his sister's telegram. Malcolm requested emergency leave again, and the manager denied it, citing the previous denial. Malcolm stopped eating lunch to save money for a train ticket to Michigan, lost weight, and the assistant supervisor commented on his appearance during an inspection. Malcolm said he was fine and continued cleaning the furnace room's concrete floor. The assistant supervisor reported that Malcolm appeared physically unwell and possibly unreliable for duties. The manager called Malcolm upstairs and asked about his health and fitness for work. Malcolm said he was healthy and capable of performing all assigned duties completely. The manager said Malcolm's appearance suggested otherwise and sent him home without pay today. Malcolm returned the next day, and the manager required a doctor's note confirming fitness. Malcolm had no money for a doctor and explained this to the manager clearly. The manager said medical documentation was required before Malcolm could return to work officially. Malcolm borrowed money from a Roxbury neighbor and visited a clinic for examination. The doctor found nothing wrong and provided a fitness note for $3. Malcolm gave the note to the manager, who read it and placed it. The manager said Malcolm could return to work, but seemed disappointed by the medical clearance. Malcolm resumed basement duties and repaid his neighbor over 4 weeks from reduced paychecks. His mother died while he was working a Tuesday evening shift in the basement. He received the telegram on Wednesday morning before leaving for work at the Roseland State Ballroom. Malcolm requested immediate emergency leave and showed the telegram to the manager as proof. The manager expressed condolences, said Malcolm had already been denied emergency leave twice before. Malcolm asked if a parent's death constituted a sufficient emergency for policy exception consideration. The manager said he would consult the employee handbook and provide an answer tomorrow. Malcolm worked his full shift and returned on Thursday for the manager's decision and answer. The manager granted 2 days of unpaid leave for the funeral but required documentation. Malcolm took the train to Michigan and attended his mother's funeral on Saturday. He returned Sunday night and worked Monday morning, exhausted and grief-stricken, but present. The manager asked for funeral documentation, and Malcolm provided the service program as proof. The manager kept the program and said it would be filed with Malcolm's personnel records. Malcolm returned to the basement and organized supplies with mechanical precision and no expression. The assistant supervisor commented that Malcolm seemed distracted and potentially unreliable for accurate work. Malcolm said nothing and continued counting inventory items for the monthly report due Friday. Malcolm's counting revealed shortages that he reported accurately in the required written documentation. The manager reviewed the report and accused Malcolm of theft based on the shortages. Malcolm explained that the shortages existed before his current shift and suggested reviewing previous inventory. The manager said Malcolm was responsible for all basement inventory, regardless of previous documentation. Malcolm was suspended without pay, pending a full investigation into missing supplies and materials. The investigation included interviews with all employees who had basement access during recent months. The white employee who had been promoted blamed Malcolm during his confidential interview session. The assistant supervisor supported this account, though he had no direct knowledge of theft. Malcolm was called to provide a statement and explained that he had only documented existing shortages. The manager said Malcolm's pattern of problems suggested guilt and unreliability throughout his employment. The investigation concluded after 3 weeks with no evidence of actual theft by anyone. Malcolm was reinstated, but the manager said trust had been damaged and behavior was suspicious. Malcolm returned to find his locker had been permanently removed from the basement area. He was required to store his belongings in the manager's office and retrieve them only. The manager personally searched Malcolm's bag each morning morning and evening without explanation or apology. Malcolm submitted to these searches silently and never questioned the procedure or its legality. His bag contained only lunch, which he had resumed bringing to save money carefully. The manager examined his sandwich and apple each morning before allowing Malcolm to work. Malcolm began bringing no lunch to avoid the inspection and worked hungry instead. The manager asked why Malcolm no longer brought food, and Malcolm said he wasn't hungry. Malcolm was assigned to clean the ballroom ceiling fixtures, requiring a tall ladder setup. The ladder was old, and one rung cracked. While Malcane was 12 feet high, Malcolm fell and landed on his left arm, breaking it in 2 places. The manager called an ambulance but asked Malcolm to finish his shift after treatment. Malcolm went to the hospital and received a cast and sling for his arm. The doctor said Malcolm could not work for 6 weeks to allow proper healing. Malcolm brought the doctor's note to the manager, who said the injury occurred. The manager said workplace injuries required immediate reporting before leaving the premises for any treatment. Malky explained he had been in severe pain, and the manager had called an ambulance. The manager said Malcolm had left without completing an incident report form first, as required. Malcolm's injury claim was denied due to a procedural violation, and he received no compensation. He could not work for 6 weeks and had no income during recovery. He was evicted from his rented room for non-payment after 3 weeks without wages. Malcolm stayed with friends in Roxbury and began selling items to buy food daily. His arm healed poorly because he could not afford follow-up medical appointments or care. He returned to the Roseland after 6 weeks with limited mobility in his left arm. The manager said the position had been filled due to Malcolm's extended absence from work. Malcolm asked about other available positions, but the manager said none existed currently. Malcolm requested a reference letter for future employment, but the manager declined to provide one. The manager said Malcolm's file contained multiple warnings and procedural violations throughout his employment. Malcolm left the Roseland State Ballroom and walked through Boston looking for any work. Every application asked for previous employment references, and Malcolm had none to provide. He explained his situation to potential employers, who thanked him and hired other candidates. Malcolm's money ran out, and he began sleeping in public parks during summer nights. He stole food from markets and was caught twice, but released with warnings. The third time, Malcolm was arrested and held overnight in a Boston city jail. The judge asked about employment, and Malcolm explained he had been injured and denied compensation. The judge sentenced Malcolm to 30 days for theft, plus time served already accumulated. Malcolm served the sentence and was released with a criminal record that appeared on applications. No employer would hire him, and Malcolm began surviving through theft and small hustles. He was arrested again for burglary, and this time, the judge recognized his name. The judge sentenced Malcolm to 8 to 10 years in state prison for repeat offenses. Malcolm entered prison and was assigned to a cell in a work detail immediately. The prison records listed him as Malcolm Little, Negro, age 20, convicted burglar and thief. Malcolm worked in the prison laundry and followed all rules precisely to avoid additional time. Guards watched him constantly and wrote reports about his compliance, behavior, and attitude daily. Malcolm remained silent, worked efficiently, and kept his eyes down just as before.